Hello, my name is Amy Glassmeyer, and I'm a professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. For the last 9 months, along with several colleagues, we have been working toward the development of this event, the 2050 American Geographical Society's vision of achieving greater equity. My talk today is a framing discussion to provide a backdrop for several of the other conversations that will be going on over the next week. What I'm basically going to do is walk us through the evolution of equality and inequality in the United States to try to provide insights into why we are currently configured as we are economically, and then what the consequences will be and some of the policy suggestions to try to change the path that we currently are on. The first thing to say is that income inequality today in the United States is at an almost all-time high. The last time that the income inequality was at this level was during the Great Depression. Most of us don't really think about income inequality because for a lot of Americans, it doesn't have an impact on them. But for about 60% of Americans, income inequality is something they live with on a daily basis. The last 50 years are made up of a period of growing income equality and us as a whole society growing together to an era in which the highest income categories are growing much more so than the lower 20% of our society. And in fact, we could say that 60 or 70% of our society have basically been experiencing static income growth for more than 30 years. I'm going to show some slides about the distribution of income inequality, wealth inequality, and then I'll use a series of other indicators to sort of set a backdrop for why we decided that this was a topic of importance, not just for the audience here, but for America as a whole. And as geographers, we're interested both in the causal forces of changes like income inequality, but we're also, of course, very interested in the spatial distribution of the phenomenon. So some of the parts of my discussion will focus specifically on that. So this begins the discussion on the distribution of family income from 1963 to 2016. And what you can see is when you start back in the early 1960s, there is certainly a gap between the 90th percentile and the 10th and the 50th percentile, but the trajectories of the line are essentially moving somewhat in the same direction. But by the time we get to the early 1980s, the directional relationship between the lines changes, and we begin to see the higher income members of society pulling away from the 10th and the 50th percentile. This pattern continues through today. Income inequality is not something which is leaving groups out. There are social groups within society where income inequality is particularly problematic. Because of historic circumstances such as slavery and Jim Crow laws and a host of other factors which we all know are sources of discrimination, we can see that African Americans or Black Americans have always had the lowest income in the United States. That's followed by Hispanics. And then we can see the population as a whole. We can see where white Americans are placed, and then we see Asian Americans. And that distribution might surprise people. The point here is to say that over time, the income inequality that has affected individual social groups has been persistent. And you can see from the range of incomes, so from 10,000 to 110,000, that there's been little progress made for African Americans, Hispanics, and that has had social consequences that we live through today. Inequality is reinforced by centuries-old regional inequality in the U.S. South versus the rest of the nation. As we all know, the plantation economy was in the South and in the Southwest. And we also know that in the period of the post-war era, we had a very strong economy in the industrial heartland, the states around the Great Lakes, the Middle Atlantic. And what we can see here is that, in fact, since the 1950s and 60s, we can see that those regions are also beginning to experience income inequality. And that is a function of something called deindustrialization, where our nation lost a significant portion of our manufacturing jobs. And so their economies are now made up of often low-wage jobs and high-wage jobs, but the middle-wage jobs with good occupational profiles and opportunities for pensions have been declining through time. So the takeaway at the beginning is the top 1%ers are outpacing growth of income compared to all other social groups. The second factor I want to think about and talk to you about is wealth inequality, which also favors the top 20%. And so what's the difference between wealth and income? Income is basically what you get paid. Wealth is what you accumulate, and wealth allows you to accumulate more and also to have a level of security that income does not provide. Income fluctuates over the course of a year, whereas wealth is a more stable form of value. Wealth inequality grows worse over time. So it has been paralleling the trajectory of income inequality, but it's had both dips and increasing trajectories relative to across time and also relative to social groups. So what we see is that wealth inequality is particularly egregious as it relates to individuals of color versus the white population. And it is continuing to spread over time. Another measure to think about is average asset income per capita. And here in this graph, we're looking at the top 10% and the bottom 90% of counties. So we're looking at counties this time from 1969 to 2019. And what we see is whereas the average asset income per capita for the top 10% has been growing progressively minus the period of the Great Recession, we can see that the bottom 90% of counties have basically been almost flat. So that means that the majority of the country has basically experienced virtually no change in average asset income per capita. That's a significant difference from what we were seeing in the early 1960s through about 1980. Here's a map that shows the same data, only it provides a really interesting sort of mirror onto where we see places that are doing well and having assets and places that are not doing well and have low average asset levels. And what's important about this map is this map shows us regions of the country that have interesting economic basis. So we see the light colored, which is less than 5,000, and the dark blue, which is greater than 20,000. And what we know about this is that some of the regions that are white, they also happen to be regions of very high natural resource wealth. So there's often local context which might provide wealth for individuals, but because of ownership issues, as well as industrial circumstances, that wealth does not distribute to the population as a whole. One of the major factors that explains why we are experiencing both income inequality and wealth inequality is the lack of access to good jobs, which limits the full economic potential. And it doesn't just limit the full economic potential for people of color, it also limits the full economic potential for individuals with less education as well as women. But there's a particularly egregious difference between African Americans and whites. The lack of equal pay for equal work inhibits lifetime earnings. Here we see in this graph, the green color is white and the black color is blue, is that there's a distinct difference between median usual weekly earnings for African Americans compared to whites. and it carries forward across both women and men and ages 25 and 54. And why that age 25 to 54 is important is because those are the prime earning years. And if your access to good jobs is diminished during that period, your lifetime earnings will also be less. The lack of access to good jobs by gender and education limits a person's full economic potential. Here we see the same color scheme, and what this graph shows is both African American and whites, and men and women, and individuals with college levels of education down to some college, veterans and young people, as well as working age people. And what we see again is that there's a persistent pattern here in terms of individuals who have a college degree, and there's a difference by race, individuals who are a veteran, and there's a difference by race. So we see this systematic pattern through time. So inequality is undergirded by lack of access to opportunity, and also long-standing differences in options for social groups. Denied jobs during their prime working years, lower lifetime earnings are the result. So here we see this pattern in terms of prime age unemployment, historically higher for Black workers versus white workers. Another factor that's important in America, and it's true for countries around the world, is retirement savings. And there's a significant difference in the availability of retirement savings by type of job, by type of region, by gender, and by race. And retirement savings in the United States are critical to economic security. It's very difficult for individuals to live on Social Security alone. And yet we know that a significant portion of Americans, all Americans, basically retire with only Social Security to rely on. Here's an example of that. So we see percent of individuals with retirement savings by race. And we can see that there's a difference by race. We can also see that even at the best case scenario, only 65% of whites have retirement savings. So it's something in which not everybody in our society actually has. College-educated families are most likely to have retirement savings. Shares of families aged 32 to 61 with retirement account savings by education is what this graph shows. And what we see is the higher the level of education, the more likely you're going to have retirement savings. And as you move down through the levels of education, you can see that individuals are disadvantaged in having a retirement savings when they reach retirement age. So education and economic security when you get older is significantly correlated. And now I'd like to talk about inequality in hourly and income earning by gender. We all know that women make about 20% less than men. What we don't know as much about is how that affects women over their life course, as well as women by race. This table shows there are gender disparities in hourly, weekly, and annual wages for women, especially women of color. So if we just look at hourly wages to begin with, and we look at comparing white women with white men, we see that there's about a 19% difference in the wage rate that a woman earns compared to a man's hourly wages. For Black women, the wage rate is much lower, 61.9%. For Latinas, it's even lower than that. Whereas for Asian women, it's actually higher. And that has to do with the fact that Asian women have high levels of education and have are more likely to go into professional occupations. If we look at weekly wages, the numbers don't change very much. And if we look at annual wages, the patterns don't change that much. But what we do see is that the distribution is clearly disadvantageous to Black women and Latinas across the entire schedule of work on an annual, weekly, or hourly basis. Male-female wage gaps widen with more education. So we generally think that as you earn more education, you are able to earn more income. But in fact, what we see in this graph is that men and women with bachelor's degree begin their life at a closer gap. The gap is much smaller, but when women reach their maximum income earning period, their wage gap between men and women is the largest, and then it eventually declines as women get out to the age of 75. And basically that's probably reflecting what happens because men tend to die before women do. And so the population in the graph changes. We see the same pattern for men and women that have less than a bachelor's degree, but we can see that the gap is different, and that may indicate that men and women are occupying very similar jobs. One of the challenges that we have today, and we know it from a lot of different perspectives, from recent elections, from the distribution of infrastructure, the availability of broadband, the availability of clean water, that poor regions are disadvantaged. They're experiencing rising inequality while falling further behind. This map shows a graphical representation of the consequences of disparities. So what we can see is the traditional South is a region of the country where there is less economic mobility compared to the lighter colored green and dark green, where we have greater mobility. And the reason that we have such a stark difference in the Midwestern part of the United States is basically the population numbers are pretty small. And if people are going to stay in the region, they actually probably need higher levels of education to be able to stay there and take good jobs. As I showed in an earlier map, this is the same map, but inequality is reinforced by the centuries-old regional inequality in the U.S. South versus the West. And although over the last 50 years, we have seen a significant change in the income structure in the Southern and the Southwestern regions, nonetheless, what we really have is an increasing bifurcation of very high incomes and significantly lower incomes, a service economy and an economy of individuals who have very high paying jobs as well as assets. Again, this map shows the assets and income per capita by county in thousands in 2019. And again, the pattern is not a lot different. And finally, less populated and poorer states tend to have larger gender wage gaps. Some of that's about tradition and the traditional jobs that are there. Some of that is about the fact that for women in some of the less populated and poorer states, it actually doesn't pay to go to work because jobs that are available to women pay significantly lower wages than men. And if they're going to have a family, then they can't actually afford childcare. So what causes all of this, and how should we really think about it? Well, one of the things that's interesting is we have the Pew Research Center is an organization that does surveys of Americans' attitudes towards lots of different topics that are important to society. And this particular graph is quite interesting because when we ask people what they think explains the disadvantage by race and by gender and also by education, what's interesting is that Americans actually understand what the source of the problem is. There's general agreement, for example, that African American inequality is due to discrimination, poor quality education, and lack of access to good jobs. And there's other factors that are important to making it harder for African Americans to be successful. So it isn't that we don't understand what inequality is, and it isn't that we don't understand why it exists. The challenge for us going forward is thinking about policies that can help diminish inequality, increase equality, and to improve the livelihood opportunities, the educational opportunities, and the economic security opportunities of others. So to talk about the issues that were presented in these slides, we will be having a presentation. We'll have a conversation with three economists: Dr. Christine Brody, economist and senior scholar at the Brookings Institution; Dania Francis, a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts at Boston; and Dr. Omri Swinton, professor and chair of the Department of Economics at Howard University. So I'm going to introduce all three of them, and then we'll go to our presentations. Okay, Dr. Christine Brody is a fellow at the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program. She's a professor of financial economics on leave at Dillard University and has served on the faculties of Howard University, Alabama A&M University, Dominican University, Fort Valley State University, and Kentucky State University. She's served as a consultant for the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies in Washington, D.C., and she's been a senior research fellow for the Center for Global Policy Solutions in Washington, D.C. Her areas of research include mortgage foreclosure, risk, labor and automation, and racial health disparities. She has a bachelor's degree in criminal justice from Alcorn State University and an MBA and PhD in business administration with a major in economics at Jackson State University. Dr. Dania Francis received her doctorate from Duke University and also holds a master's degree from Harvard University and a bachelor's degree from Smith College. She is currently an assistant professor at UMass Boston. She is the co-author of an influential paper titled The Economics of Reparations in the American Economic Review. Her research has also been published in Science, Review of Development Economics, and Review of Black Political Economy, among other peer-reviewed journals. Her research uses experimental and quasi-experimental methods to identify structural causes of racial and socioeconomic academic achievement gaps. She is a board member of the National Economics Association and a National Academies of Education Spencer Foundation Postdoctoral Fellowship Award recipient, 2018-2019. And then finally, Dr. Omri Swinton, chairman of the economics department at Howard University in Washington, D.C. He received his master's degree and PhD in economics at Duke University, and Swinton has been on the faculty of Howard University since 2007 and has been chair of the economics department since 2017. In February 2019, he was interviewed by J.P. Morgan about building wealth. He has been the president of the National Economic Association in 2019. His stated goal for the organization was to encourage minorities to enter the field of economics. His research focuses on access to higher education, student retention, and the success of historically Black colleges. So from here, we will turn now to our guests and talk about both the causes of inequality and really focus on the ways in which we as a nation can address some of the persistent issues that I've discussed just previously. I'd like to ask my panelists to comment on really the broadest question that this panel is about. And that is, in the next 3 decades, what in each of your minds is the greatest single economic change required to bring about greater equality in the United States? And I'll begin by asking Dr. Brody.
It's an easy question. It's our ending rate. I would say that the answer to the question is easy. Implementing it is much harder. Ending racism.
Dr. Francis, would you like to comment on that question?
Sure, absolutely. No, I definitely agree that ending racism would go a long way towards bringing about greater inequality in the U.S. As someone who studies the economics of reparations, I think that one major policy to consider would be reparations for African Americans. I think that wealth inequality lies beneath so much of the inequality we observe today. Access to opportunity, education, good neighborhoods that are free from health risks, right? But the wealth inequality that you so eloquently described in the intro to the section didn't happen overnight, right? It's the result of decades, centuries of state-sanctioned policies and laws that disadvantaged some and advantaged others. Thinking of slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, urban renewal, right? We can go on. And so I think that pattern of advantage and disadvantage is transmitted intergenerationally through intergenerational wealth transfers, differential access to wealth building opportunities, and really a really effective way to address this gap in wealth is to transfer wealth, right? And so for that reason, I think that, if we're talking about, bigger, broader, bolder policies that would be able to affect change, I think reparations need to be on the table.
Dr. Swinton, how can people understand reparations? And have you thought about mechanisms that would enable this to work?
I think one of the I would have to echo. If it and I think one of the points that Dania made is the important one, to acknowledge that the wealth gaps that exist in America didn't happen by accident. And I think that's the biggest thing to get people to understand the need for reparations, is to acknowledge that if you look back at the U.S. history before the 1900s, almost everybody in the U.S. was equally poor, right? And then systems were designed that advantage others at the cost of other groups. And so whether you think about immigrants coming into the U.S., or Native Americans in their lands, Blacks or women, a lot of these disparities that we see are designed into the way our society operates. And the first thing is to acknowledge that these things exist and try to think about the best ways to approach eliminating some of the systematic functioning of our society that continue to lead to these disparities to continue to exist. The best example of that is redlining, and how those effects still occur to this day. If you're a Black family, there's been studies that shown if you're at your home when their appraisal is done, the value of your home will be less. If you're not there and you take away all your pictures, the value of your home will be more. And that's really an artificial creation from the way our society operates. There's many instances like this in society that can be addressed, but first people have to acknowledge that these kind of biases actually exist. And a large part of the population of America don't believe that these kind of things really exist in our society.
And do you mind if I add to that? Because I think it's so important to think about the significance of the example that Amari just gave. That right, you think, oh, it's an appraisal. Okay, maybe it appraised for a little more, a little less. That has real financial consequences, right? That even have multiplier effects, right? So my appraisal is what's used for me to, refinance my home or even get my home loan. And if I end up getting a worse termed loan because my appraisal was not as high as it maybe should be, right? That's real financial consequences. I may not be able to get a home equity loan of the amount that I would like if my appraisal is lower. Maybe I'm using that home equity loan to invest in a small business, right? Like there are ways that, we use these financial instruments to grow wealth that if people are systematically discriminated in this finance industry are not able to have those same wealth growing opportunities.
Dr. Brody, being at the Brookings Institute, and also being in Washington at this moment, what kinds of conversations are you hearing about how we achieve greater equality in the United States?
So I guess agreeing with Dr. Swinton and Dr. Francis, I think the first step is to point out the problem. And so that's something that we've done. The wealth gap information that most people hear and quote comes from 2 papers written by the Hamilton Project. So I think just to point out a couple of things that we're going in the wrong direction. So according to a report by Zillow, between 1990 and 2018, the home ownership rate between Black and white households increased from 27.6 percentage points to 30.3 percentage points. So the gap in home ownership is getting wider. The second thing, a 2009 study by Turner and Liu found that each additional year of home ownership increased total net wealth by $13,700 for a sample of low and moderate income households, right? So first, that's the problem we're going in the wrong direction. 2, just what is the value of home ownership for the population that we're talking about is the second thing. So I guess some of the things that we're looking at are programs like Buy Back the Block, which look at how nonprofits and government agencies can help minorities, particularly and low-income people of all races, buy property and not just rent, right? We know that African Americans, particularly, and people of lower income are more likely to rent than to buy. And if you're not buying, then you're not building equity. So, and it's not just buying property to live in, but also to be able to have a business. You can have your own business, but if you're renting and somebody sells the building, then what are you supposed to do, right? It's not really yours if you don't own the property. So Buy Back the Block is one thing, looking at encouraging more Black people to get into the appraisal field. And it's not just a matter of saying that, oh, I want to be an appraiser. We know that there's racism and discrimination in terms of getting into the various programs, but we do need more Black appraisers. We need more Black people in real estate, in banking. We need more Black banks, right? So all of those are things that we're researching.
Dr. Francis, what do you hear your students talking about today as it relates to achieving greater equality? And how do they see the generations before them setting them up for a future? What kind of future do they think they're going to experience?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So let me first start by saying that at UMass Boston, we have a really, really diverse student body, which is excellent. And I enjoy coming to work and teaching under that auspice. So I think that, my students come from, lots of different backgrounds, not just racial backgrounds, but regarding, socioeconomic status, regarding immigration status, regarding families who were served in the military and so on. And so it's really, really interesting and fun to have conversations about things like economic mobility. People are coming from all different places. And I think one of the main keys is that if you don't have the experience of talking to people who are coming from different backgrounds and different experiences, and maybe all kind of is your narrow life experience, you may have lots of misconceptions about what causes inequality, right? What leads to economic mobility, right? And so if you've come from a background where you've experienced privileges, maybe privileges that you don't even necessarily notice that you experience, but you have a comfortable home life, you've had the best schools, right? Then you think, I worked hard and that's why I am where I am. And if you don't know the circumstances of other people, you may see them and say, they must not be working hard. And that's why they're where they are, right? When in actuality, if we spoke to each other a little more, we'd see, oh, wow, these are people who are also working hard, but maybe they didn't have this advantage, just by nature of the family into which they were born, right? Like, and so I think that, you know, a key thing is really understanding, educating across differences, talking to people from different experiences, so that we're outside of our own bubbles, and in order to understand better what are the sources of inequality.
Dr. Swinton, you too are teaching students today, and you're in the nation's capital, and there's lots of discussion about policy swirling around. How are your students preparing themselves for the future, and what are they expecting in the way of change in the economy, and what do they think their role is in that experience?
So the aspect of the question I'm gonna focus on is, what is our students' role? And we oftentimes talk about, you know, having representation in the policy field and in the places where these policies are made. Economics as a field is very unwelcoming to most people who are not from traditional backgrounds. And it's a hard time to encourage students to do economics as a field. But economists sit in almost every think tank in the government, and they're the ones who make these policies. And oftentimes, a lot of the policies have unintended effects because people don't understand the way people think or react. And because they haven't lived those experiences, when they make the policies, they don't take into consideration that somebody might view this policy in a different light, right? And as economists, I try to teach my students to understand that just because you have a certain way that you view the world and you have these certain goals, it doesn't mean everybody has those same goals. And I often talk about understanding when you make a policy that somebody's utility function might look completely different from yours. And they might be choosing to do something because of a different set of calculations than you are. And so it has to be clear at what your ultimate goals are. In one of my classes, we always talked about measuring inequality and how different policies would be used if you had different goals in decreasing inequality, right? And if your goal is to help the poorest people, that's an entirely different conversation than if your goal is to decrease the wealth gap between the richest and the poorest, right? And so these different types of policies have different effects, and teaching the students to think about what your ultimate goal is as how to design a policy is something that we focus on in our classes when we talk about policy changes and the effects that they have.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I think it's also very instructive to other academics who are trying to contribute to conversations or trying to help their students engage in conversations about policymaking without necessarily recognizing the divergence between the types of policies that you're interested in and how you actually go about approaching them. Dr. Brody, you are in perhaps the preeminent social science think tank in the United States, the Brookings Institution. And to what extent do you find that that's an environment where you are able to have an effect that you can't have necessarily in the academy?
So it's a good question. I haven't changed at all. I actually worked for Dr. Swinton and his father at Benedict, and I'm the same person. I wrote a brief called Race and Jobs at High Risk to Automation while I was working for Dr. Swinton. I was working for the Joint Center as well, and it got some publicity. It was heavily cited. It was cited by Congress, and I did a few interviews, and that was that. I did an update to that same report at Brookings in March of this year, and you reached out to me, and you're at MIT, and here I am, right? And news agencies have reached out, and I've been on radio, and I've been on TV. I'm the same person. It's basically the same report. It's updated data, right? So working at Brookings means that my voice gets heard by more people and I get to have more of an influence, and I can share this information with students at HBCUs and faculty members and administrators to let them know what they need to do to prepare their students for jobs that I knew about, but couldn't have really told you what folks at the Brookings Institution did, what was required of interns, what an RA was from the think tank side. So I would say it's been a blessing that I've learned all the things that I've learned and been able to share that information with the people that I care most about.
Thank you. Dr. Francis, in what ways do you see economics as helping us in the future to achieve greater equality? What is it about that field and the way that people who are trained as economists are able to influence where we're going in the future?
Yeah, I think the field of economics and economists broadly have the ability to do a lot of good, right? I think that part of the benefit comes in, doing very careful, data-driven, right, evidence-driven analyses of some of our larger social questions, right? I think that it becomes even more beneficial when we as economists realize that these large questions, these large societal questions, cannot be answered by economists alone, and that most of our largest social questions require interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary collaborations that help us understand really the scope of these topics. And so I think that we would have the best influence and impact if we do what we do best and fit into larger discussions about some of these large social topics, instead of thinking maybe, oh, we have the data, we solved the question, we figured it out, and any other discipline, right, it can't possibly be doing it as well as we're doing, right? I think that's when we start to maybe do more harm than good. I'll stop there.
Dr. Brody, I'd like to ask you the same question. You are currently in an environment that is maybe not as tightly constrained by the role of academic output and particular approaches to economic problem solving. How do you find being in a policy environment enabling you to sort of broaden and stretch or essentially approach economics perhaps with a different set of eyes?
So I think not having the teaching responsibility or the specific publishing requirements of you have to publish in this many A journals or have this many sole authored papers is freeing. And I will say I'm an associate editor of a journal that I love, so I don't want to be saying anything against academic publishing. I don't have any ill will towards it, but I would say that think tank publishing is much faster because everyone is dedicated to it, right? Like if I'm doing some research, I have other fellows that I can run things by, have research assistants and analysts. So everybody is supporting that mission rather than being student focused, which of course we need universities to do in addition to the research that they produce. So I think being able to do things faster and more focused is important. We can react more to what's going on in the economy. We can choose what we analyze and just put things out faster, I think it is the biggest thing. I guess I also want to say something about what Dr. Francis said. I think that economists are the best, right? I mean, come on, you guys can agree with that. Of course, we need to fit into an interdisciplinary approach, but I think as I've looked at Twitter and looked at think tank people versus academics and others, I think that we need to end the sort of competitive backbiting that I see, right? This debate about macro versus micro or qualitative data versus quantitative. Honestly, I'm sick of it, right? Like I've seen people coming out with articles saying that that economists don't look at the data correctly, and that you have to have qualitative, and that economists don't do qualitative research. It's like, let's stop all of that. I think that we're all capable of doing qualitative and quantitative research. We all have our various focuses, and we should all work together instead of fighting against each other.
Dr. Swinton, if you had one policy that you could make today and take it to the White House and have a sit down with President Biden about the prospect of introducing it into Congress as legislation, what would that policy be?
So, I haven't really thought that deeply about that question, but I'm gonna give you the first thing that came to my mind is that the federal government should actually fund HBCUs at a higher level than they do. Historically, Black colleges and universities actually do a much better job of educating Blacks than they get credit for, just based on a lot of the research that has been out. Some of my own research shows that Black students who would have attended the HBCU versus a predominantly white institution would have increased their likelihood of graduating from anywhere to 5 to 10%. Additionally, if given looking at those who just graduate, they would have been more likely to graduate in a STEM degree. A lot of the discussion in higher education is about making sure all professions are diversified and we increase the share of minority groups in these fields. HBCUs have a track record of doing it. They're already a protected class of colleges and universities that exist. And it really wouldn't be that hard to actually help with their funding level to maybe allow students who go there to have free school, because this would in one way help get rid of some of the disparities that exist due to what the US has done a long time ago.
Dr. Francis, if you had a chance to have a sit down with the president and really formulate a policy for the moment in light of all that's happening, and also the basic constraints that we face in a globalized world, what would that policy look like?
So obviously, I would sit down and talk about reparations. But aside from that, I think that a policy or a group of policies that focus on working families navigating poverty is so important, right? I think that, universal pre-K, making sure children are fed, right? Payments to families who are just trying to get by and meet basic needs is so important in trying to make sure that children flourish, right? If you're navigating homelessness, if you're navigating poverty, if your family is trying to figure out where the next meal is going to come from, you're not going to flourish. And I think that just exacerbates inequality, and it really limits our capacity to grow as a nation, for one, and even thinking on the global scale, because we're not investing the most we can in all of our citizens, right? And so there's probably somebody who may have been the next genius, right, who we're not investing in because we don't have some of these safety net policies.
Thank you. That's a very important topic, and I know that in some of the statistics that I was looking at in preparation for our meetup, one of the topics that came up over and over again was the generation to come and the extent to which we are prepared to actually invite them in, if you will, into the world, and then ensure that the resources that are necessary for them to thrive are present in their communities. Dr. Brody, this is a macro question, basically. Right now, some people would argue that the economics that we live within are those which are a sort of an economics worldview, is to stay out of the way of the market, to in the distribution of resources to the greatest extent possible. And that is the mechanism by which allocation of resources will achieve the greatest efficiency. But that kind of mindset is one that is of many mindsets about what the kind of economics, the kind of macroeconomics we might need at this moment in American history to try to deal with questions of inequality. Do we need something like the Great Depression and then the sort of Keynesian era policies as a means by which we can evolve? Or is there something about where we're going now sufficient to actually enable us to achieve greater equality?
So I think left to itself, the market brings about inequality, right? Like when we look at the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of economists report that the unemployment rate has come down and people are getting jobs and they're getting vaccinated and everything is great. But when we look at how different groups are being affected, we see that Black people, our unemployment rate is still much higher than white people. Same thing for Hispanic people. And when you look at the rate for those 16 to 19, African Americans 16 to 19, the average unemployment rate for the last 13 months is like 17 to 18%. So yeah, if we leave the market to itself, then we would see automation, which has increased during the pandemic, that companies that wanted to institute some sort of automation, automatic checkout machines, etc., but hadn't done it because they would have had to shut down and lose business, saw this as an opportunity to do that. They were closed down anyway. So what happens to the people that were cashiers or salespeople that don't have a job to go back to? If we leave it to them and just say, oh, go do something else, there are plenty of jobs available, but how if people don't have broadband? They don't know that those jobs exist. They may not have the specific training required for it. They may not have transportation to get to that job. Childcare costs have gone up, right? So we can't just leave it to people to figure it out. Like that's not how our economy works, especially not when so much has been done, as Dr. Swinton said, to keep certain people down, right? Like we didn't get to this point of inequality through lack of policy, slavery, redlining, all of the different types of discrimination, lack of funding for schools. All of these things were policies, right? So it's like, we're not gonna get equalized through lack of policy. That wouldn't make sense at all.
Can I chime in on this point? So I think one of the main things that people get wrong when they talk about markets is that there's no discrimination in the markets, right? And the markets would be the best outcome possible if everything worked where everybody had the same access to every opportunity. But we know that's not the case in America. And as long as that's not the case, there's going to be no way that the market can lead to an equitable distribution because some groups don't have the same opportunities. And this is the point of the government, is to step in where there's a market failure and try to correct some of the access issues that exist. And so the markets are great. The economy is great for some people, and it has to be the recognition that the economy doesn't work for everybody. And until everybody can recognize that, even though some people may be doing well, there's going to be a segment of the population who's not doing well, and support the government when it tries to step in and help out in those instances, you'll still have these same problems exist. I'll give COVID-19 as the best example, where the government said our economy can't function. We're going to help everybody, right? Imagine the government says this group of people don't have the same opportunities. We're going to make sure they get the help they need to be successful because we know the market's going to fail them. We'd have a different type of society if that was the case.
So you know that I run a living wage calculator, and we did an experiment early in COVID to see what the consequences were of the $600 a week additional resources that were provided by households. And so we basically made a simulation which added all of that income to every person and everyone's situation in every county in the country. And we asked a simple question, which was, what does that $600 a week do to people who are currently not making a living wage? And what we found was that a very small fraction of individuals in the country were unable to actually have a living wage with that additional funding. So we sort of found a point at which we knew people had resources to cover their expenses and perhaps put some money away. We then deducted, we went down to $400, and we started to see the population of people who couldn't cover their costs begin to expand. And then we reduced it to $200, and we saw that a lot more people without that additional boost of $200 or $400 additional dollars actually were unable to cover their costs. So if you were working in the White House right now, and this is going to be my last question, Dr. Francis, in light of the experiment that I described to you, what do you think the fastest way is for us to provide some level of security for Americans at this moment?
That's a great question. There's two things come to mind for me. The first is exactly as you described, putting cash in people's hands and not sort of being what I would maybe describe as paternalistic about it and saying you have to spend this way, right? And trusting that, people by and large are going to be doing the things that are the most beneficial for their families and in helping their families grow. And so putting cash in hands, I think, is an important aspect. The second thing, is really focusing on, I think, affordable childcare, right? And I know some people say, well, not everybody has children, and you asked for a broad-reaching, right, like policy, but there's so many women, families broadly, who would benefit from affordable childcare and being able to detach themselves from a bad working situation, right? Advance themselves with education. And there's so many sort of avenues of growth that I think workers in the US would benefit from if we had more affordable childcare.
Dr. Brody, if you had one area in light of what I said in terms of how much money people actually need to pay their bills, what would that be?
So I agree with Dr. Francis. Money in hands would be number one, but as far as a real policy, I would say the policy laid out by Richard Aram and Mitchell Stevens in a Hamilton Project paper on learning opportunity credits. So it would basically change the way higher ed is funded. It would mean that workers, people who had already been in the field in their career, could use this learning opportunity credit from the government to attend a school in their area, in their neighborhood, a local 2-year, 4-year institution, to take the courses they needed to move forward in their career. It wouldn't necessarily mean a full degree. It would eliminate the requirement of taking all of the various prereqs and just kind of make it easier for people who need to take a few more classes or get a degree to do so. It would work with accreditation agencies and just other things to make it easier for people to get the education that they need, because it's very difficult right now.
And then finally, Dr. Swinton, if you could have one adjustment made at this moment, what would that be?
My main adjustment would be to increase the minimum wage in conjunction with equal pay for women. And there's many households where in poverty happen to be female-headed households, and if we actually had equal pay for equal work, as a rule, it would help a lot of the households that have the greatest need. And increasing the minimum wage would help improve the standard of living. In if you look at your inequality map from the beginning, almost all of those states on that map are the states that have the lowest minimum wage and haven't increased their minimum wage on their own.
Well, I'd like to thank my participants in this conversation. I believe that the recommendations that have been made really are ones that are not just recommendations without consideration of prospect of implementation, but really are ways in which immediately in the short run, we could make adjustments that would truly transform people's lives. And I believe that the COVID experiment is the best example that we can take away and understand that it's not that Americans don't want to work. It's not that Americans want to sit back and not participate. It is, in fact, that there's not sufficient resources in the hands of families, in the hands of single mothers or fathers, for children. And until we reconcile these very basic things, these things that all of us want, to have happy and healthy and safe families, that we are going to basically continue to struggle, and we're going to continue to feel divided rather than as members of a whole nation. So thank you all very much. I really appreciate it, and I hope to see you in the future.